Everyone thought it would be short. Not optimists. Not people trying to sound brave. Everyone, generals, economists, journalists, even the people who would eventually be sent to fight it. They weren't debating whether the war would end quickly. They were debating how quickly. Weeks, some said. A few months, others insisted. No one was preparing for years. Because preparing for years would mean admitting something no one wanted to admit. They were all wrong, and the unsettling part isn't that a war lasted longer than expected. It's that at the start, the belief in a short war didn't feel like a gamble. It felt like the only reasonable conclusion. What's easy to miss is that this belief didn't appear overnight. It formed quietly, long before the first shot was fired. Years of assumptions stacked on top of each other. Every new crisis ended quickly. Every previous conflict seemed manageable. Each example became another data point. Another reason to believe this time would be the same. And once a belief reaches that stage, it stops feeling like an opinion. It starts feeling like common sense. At that point, disagreeing doesn't make you cautious, it makes you look unreasonable. And that's exactly why it worked. The world had changed. Communication was instant. Transportation was fast. Mobilization could happen in days, not months. Weapons were more powerful. Logistics more efficient. Everything about modern life suggested the same thing. A long war wouldn't just be painful, it would be impossible. Economists argued that extended conflict would freeze trade, break supply chains, and crush national budgets. In other words, war had become too expensive to last very long. Military planners built their timelines around it. Politicians made promises based on it. The press repeated it until it sounded like fact. And recent history seemed to confirm it. Short wars, decisive outcomes, clear endings. Experts didn't speak in absolutes. They used probabilities, ranges, confidence intervals. Nothing sounded reckless. Everything sounded controlled. Graphs showed rapid conclusions. Models showed diminishing returns. Simulations ended neatly. Each presentation reduced uncertainty into something manageable, something technical, and when uncertainty feels technical, it feels solvable. This wasn't propaganda, it was professionalism, and that made it far more convincing. So when the crisis finally arrived, the plan wasn't how to survive a long war. The plan was how to win a short one. And that single assumption quietly shaped everything that followed. When the war began, the world didn't collapse. Early operations moved, orders were followed, supply lines held. The first report sounded almost comforting. Objectives met, progress made, momentum building. To many observers, this wasn't just good news, it was proof. But early success didn't prove the plan was right. It bought time. It postponed doubt. It made the mistake harder to see. Every update reset expectations. Each briefing implied progress, even when nothing had changed. Language became the buffer. Words like stabilizing, repositioning, strategic patience. They didn't describe success. They delayed alarm. And the longer that language worked, the more dangerous it became. Because it trained people to wait. And waiting began to feel responsible. Weeks turned into months. The war didn't end, but it also didn't obviously fail. And that was the trap, because as long as nothing looked catastrophic, there was no single moment when stopping felt urgent, only a growing sense that the ending was still coming. And the longer people waited for it, the harder it became to admit it wasn't arriving. At some point, the question changed. It was no longer how soon this would be over. It became how much had already been invested. Resources had been committed, reputations attached, promises made, and the price of stopping started to feel higher than the price of continuing. Admitting the war wouldn't be short didn't sound like honesty, it sounded like failure. For generals, failure meant careers. For politicians, credibility. For institutions, trust. The system didn't reward caution, it rewarded consistency. Plans that stayed the same looked stable. Plans that changed looked uncertain. Continuing the war signaled leadership. Questioning it signaled weakness. So even doubt had to be managed, privately acknowledged, publicly avoided. Over time, the difference between belief and performance stopped mattering. What mattered was staying aligned. The war kept going, not because victory was certain, but because backing down felt unthinkable. Each extension sounded reasonable on its own. One more push to regain momentum, one more escalation to force an ending, one more year to justify the last one. No single decision turned it into a long war. 1,000 reasonable decisions did. And once you're inside that logic, the war doesn't need to be winnable. It only needs to be ongoing. Looking back, the warning signs seem obvious. The timelines slipped, the costs rose, the reasons kept shifting. But at the time, the signs weren't invisible. They were inconvenient. They forced a question no one wanted to ask. What if this doesn't end soon? Years later, people would ask how it happened, why no one stopped it sooner. But those questions come from hindsight, from a place where the outcome is already known. At the time, nothing felt final. Everything still felt adjustable. And as long as something feels adjustable, it doesn't feel urgent. That's the quiet danger of believing something won't last. The most damaging belief wasn't that the war was justified, it was that it would be brief. Because when people believe something won't last long, they accept decisions they would never accept if they thought it would last. So here's the uneasy thought. How many things do we tolerate only because we believe they won't last?